Here's a guy who thinks atheists are telling lies.
Adolf Hitler ordered 20,946,000 killed, although many more were killed as a result of the war that he caused. Chiang Kai-shek ordered 10,214,000 of his own people murdered. In the last 100 years, atheist leaders have ordered 170 million people murdered through their own government bureaucracies. It's far and away the most deaths of any type caused by any group of people. Now, at this point, some people might feebly point out that Hitler was not an atheist. He was a Christian, and that's simply incorrect. Let's read two Hitler quotes. The first one, Hitler says, "The heaviest blow that ever struck humanity was the coming of Christianity." Doesn't sound like a Christian to me. Hitler also said National Socialism and religion cannot coexist together, because Hitler is indeed part of the ever-growing list of atheist men and women who have allowed the natural course of their belief system to hurt beautiful, innocent people that they disagreed with.
Both of those quotes are from the book Hitler's Table Talk, which is notoriously mistranslated, and are quotations taken largely from Martin Bormann, a known anti-Christian, not from Hitler directly. These are not things Hitler himself wrote, and there are no sound recordings of him saying them. Also, even if Hitler actually said these things, neither of them constitute a declaration of atheism. Opposing Christianity and religion does not make you an atheist. The same book quotes Hitler as saying that people should abandon religious institutions, so der Mensch soll in der Lage sein, die ihm von Gott gegebenen Fähigkeiten zu entwickeln. This means humanity should be in a position to develop its God-given abilities. That's a weird thing for an atheist to say. Perhaps Hitler was not a Christian, although that's disputable. But there is no reason at all to believe that he was an atheist. Next, this dude will try to whitewash the Crusades.
As a wave of refugees flowed into Central Europe, people heard about the horrible atrocities that were committed. They said, we're going to go fight back. There were aggressors on both sides, and during the 9 wars over hundreds of years, between 1 and 1.7 million people were killed. I will acknowledge here that on their way to the battlefield, the Christians committed horrible atrocities. It's horrible. But there were aggressors on both sides.
Many of the horrible atrocities committed on the way to the battlefield were Christian armies killing other Christians. These atrocities weren't committed to retaliate against atrocities committed by Muslims, so the fact that Muslims also committed atrocities is irrelevant. It doesn't get these Christians off the hook. Many of the soldiers who went to fight in the Crusades were not really soldiers. They were often ordinary peasants who were told that if they went to Jerusalem to fight Muslims, they would essentially get a free ticket to heaven. So lots of folks got together and decided to walk to Jerusalem, and on their way, because they were not real armies given funding from a state, they were poor and had no food, and when they got hungry, they would just pillage the nearest village. This happened so often that many of these armies never even made it to Jerusalem, because once word got around that there were bands of zealots marauding their way through Europe, a lot of places closed their borders to them and refused to let them through. They were forced to return home, having killed only their fellow Christians and having accomplished exactly nothing. And this was largely because they were under the belief that as long as they got to Jerusalem and killed a few Muslims, all the bad shit they did on their way there would be forgiven and they would get into heaven.
In the 20th century, there were 127 avowed atheist leaders, 127 avowed atheist heads of state, which is actually when you're looking at heads of state, that's actually a pretty large sample size, because there aren't that many heads of state at one time. So 127 avowed atheist heads of state, and of those, 58% of them ended up killing major portions of their population during the course of their reign. It's not the type of government that they had in common, it's not the ethnicity or culture that they had in common, it is their belief system.
I highly doubt that the atheist leaders who killed major portions of their populations had nothing in common with regard to the form of government they led. How many of them maintained free and fair elections during the time they were in power? I doubt it was very many. Also, correlation is not causation. The fact that they were atheist and killed people does not mean that they killed people because they were atheist. You need to show some kind of mechanism by which one causes the other if you want to make a strong case for causation.
And I'd like to give you the fair counterpoint about Christian Orthodox leaders who have killed major portions of their population, but fortunately or unfortunately, the number is so small that we don't have substantive data on it.
What do you mean by Christian Orthodox leaders? He's not a member of one of the Eastern Orthodox or Greek Orthodox churches, so I don't think that's what he means. I think he inserted the word Orthodox as a no true Scotsman get-out-of-jail-free card that he can use to dismiss any examples contrary to his position. I suspect that if you showed him the atrocities committed by Christian leaders, he'd simply dismiss them as unorthodox.
Paul writes in Romans 8:6, he says, so letting your sinful nature control your mind leads to death. And what he's saying here is when you say, I am my own authority, when you say, I am my own God, right? When you say, God is not an accountability to me, God doesn't exist, God's not a relevant thing to me, I am my own accountability, it leads to death. And that is true statistically.
No, it isn't. If you look, for example, at American states, the murder rates are pretty consistently inversely proportional to the prevalence of atheism. I'm not saying that atheism therefore causes low murder rates. What I'm saying is that the statistics simply do not point to the idea that atheism in a population leads to death.
Okay? Then he says, but letting the Spirit control your mind leads to life and peace. What's amazing to me is people who follow the teachings of Jesus, societies that follow the teachings of Jesus, experience greater prosperity and peace.
Well, yes, of course, societies that act according to the peaceful teachings of Jesus will be peaceful, but you don't have to be a Christian to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. This is a maxim that predates Jesus.
This is a fact. This is not me saying it. This is real. For the sinful nature is always hostile to God. It never did obey God's laws, and it never will.
Maybe a sinful nature will never obey all of your God's laws. It probably won't obey the silly ones like not making graven images or not working on the Sabbath. But there are plenty of people who are in rebellion against God, to use the Christian terminology, who have no trouble at all obeying the laws against stealing and murdering.
I think people who believe in atheism should be shown the truth in love, right? I mean, that means a conversation. Say, hey, I love you enough to tell you that the religion you're a part of has caused the greatest atrocities of the 20th century.
Do you think that I'm going to commit atrocities? Do you believe that if I were in charge of a country, I would kill millions of people simply because I'm an atheist? If I were in charge of a country, I would aim to emulate the policies of the countries with the happiest people. And guess what? Those aren't the most religious countries. They aren't even the most Christian countries. The countries with the highest percentage of Christians are not the ones with the least violence or the greatest prosperity.
I want you to understand that what you decide to believe has consequences for human society and the human endeavor in general. And I love you enough to ask you, to implore you to consider a better way for your good and for the good of society.
What do you think the consequences of me being atheist will be? And even if there were negative consequences, do you expect me to just start believing in things that make absolutely no sense to me because it would be good for me and society? That's not how belief works. If I don't find something convincing, I can't just will myself to believe it, even if it were the case that I'd be better off believing it.
The second myth I want to address is a myth that says atheism is not a religion, and that Christians are dumb, atheists are bold, smart, free thinkers.
I definitely don't believe that anyone is a bold, smart, free thinker merely because they are an atheist. And what do you think an atheist is? Many atheists call themselves atheists because they are not theists. They merely lack a belief. How can a lack of a belief be a religion? And even when it comes to the atheists who hold the belief that there is no God, if they arrive at that conclusion from the lack of evidence for a God, that's merely an inductive inference. It's not a dogma or article of faith.
I think there's this sort of inferiority complex among Christians today. I think we walk around thinking, oh yeah, we're just dumb lemmings, we're just kind of sheep, and atheists are bold, smart, free thinkers. They're all the educated, smart people. And that's actually not true. I define religion as a belief system built on faith, right? I think that's a pretty good definition of religion.
The atheism of those who simply lack a belief in a God is not a belief system. And the atheism of those who inductively infer that there is no God is not faith. So neither kind of atheism can be called a religion by that definition.
I think the best religion, Christianity, has informed faith. I think most religions have what I call blind faith. You just have to take it blindly. And I think some religions have faith that is willfully ignorant. That means willfully ignoring facts and evidence to preserve a belief system that is clearly, empirically, and factually not real. For instance, the Book of Mormon has to willfully ignore a bunch of facts. Like we know Joseph Smith was spurious, right? We know that the Book of Mormon we know for a fact that it's not legitimate. Atheism as a religion is willfully ignorant. We know that something doesn't come from nothing. You have to ignore that fact.
That's a fact that Christians ignore. You believe that something does come from nothing. You believe that your God made something come from nothing. If something can't come from nothing, then how can your God make something come from nothing?
Right? You have to pretend like God doesn't exist when we know for a fact something doesn't come from nothing. Romans 1:20 says, "For ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and sky. Through everything God made, they can clearly see His invisible qualities, His eternal power, and His divine nature. So they have no excuse for not knowing God."
How exactly does one clearly see His invisible qualities? That's a self-contradictory statement. The fact that such an assertion makes no sense is something you seem to be willfully ignoring. But maybe this passage simply means that the fact that things exist is somehow evidence of a timeless, spaceless, disembodied creator. I don't see how that follows at all. That seems to me to be a total non sequitur.
I love that the more science advances, the more we understand that God is real. DNA did not happen by accident. Double helix DNA was designed. There's no way it could have evolved. And yet the simplest life forms that we have, that we supposedly evolved from, all have this incredibly complicated structure in it.
Nobody is saying that DNA happened by accident. And why does complexity require design?
The universe is so elegant, its fine-tuning was not an accident.
Typically, when apologists point out the fine-tuning of the universe, they mean it was fine-tuned for life. In other words, if the physical parameters of the universe were even slightly different, life couldn't exist. But why would an all-powerful God need to fine-tune a universe for life? Why couldn't he just put life in any universe? Is a God not alive in some sense? If a God is alive and is not contingent upon the existence of any universe, let alone a finely tuned one, then clearly life does not need a fine-tuned universe.
I love that physicists continue to move away from atheism because the more they learn about our universe, the more they recognize there's a supernatural force behind it.
Yeah, citation needed.
Atheism requires you to ignore the clear empirical evidence that points to God's existence.
How could empirical evidence point to something supernatural? It's not clear to me what the supernatural even is, or what a God even is, so how would we know what evidence for such a thing would even look like? And why would a natural explanation not be a simpler explanation than a supernatural explanation?
There's a very famous scientist, his name is Michio Kaku, right? And he's a co-author of this new theory called string theory. For a long time, this guy named Edwin Hubble discovered that our universe was expanding. I gave another talk about this, it's linked in the description. But basically what that means is he discovered that our universe had a starting point, which means instead of being infinite, it was finite, which means there was a supernatural being behind it, which started it. This was sort of a death blow for atheism.
What? No, it wasn't. Even if the universe had a beginning, that doesn't mean it had a cause. And even if it did mean that it had a cause, it didn't mean that it had a supernatural cause.
Then this guy authored this new theory called string theory, right? String theory says that our universe is merely one of infinite amounts of universes within the greater cosmos. This, again, allowed room for atheism, which believed there was no being behind it because it's just always been here. Last year, I want to read to you a quote that he released. It says, "I have concluded that we are in a world made by rules created by an intelligence. To me, it is clear that we exist in a plan which is governed by rules that were created, shaped by a universal intelligence, not by chance." In other words, he's saying God existed.
Yeah, Michio Kaku has long pandered to woo peddlers and is pretty far from representing the consensus of the scientific community.